Funding for this broadcast provided by the members of KRWG. Become a member anytime at krwg.org. Chamber funding from Bank of the West, Kriegel, Gray & Shaw, Bohannon Houston, the Las Cruces Sun News, the Las Cruces Bulletin, and Comcast. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Chamber Economic Forum. Special thanks going out to the Greater Las Cruces Chamber of Commerce for helping to organize today's event, and to New Mexico State University and College of Business professors Jim Peach, Chris Erickson, and Ken Martin. We'll have opening remarks from them in just a moment, as well as questions from our studio audience. And we begin with Jim Peach, who's going to take a look at the national economy.
Thank you. And I'd also like to thank KRWG, the Chamber, and Bank of the West, and the other sponsors for inviting us back. I think all three of us really enjoy this interaction here. In December 2007, the United States entered a very long and very deep recession. And if you can have a look at the first slide up here, I've compared GDP growth rates up there, real GDP growth rates in the current recession, that's the blue line, with the average of the last 10 recessions, just so that you could, and that's all of them in the post-war period. As you can see, we backed up, that's all right. We came out of this a little bit weaker, and we've now experienced a deceleration of GDP growth, and that's an important thing to look at. This next slide right here shows just the last 3 recessions and the rate of GDP growth after the bottom of those 3 recessions. Again, we are the blue line, and you don't have to be an economist to understand that that's not, you're too fast on those slides. You're already up to employment. That's all right. That's okay. That's okay. There's the GDP thing again. This is the first recession since the end of World War II that we are still below, still slightly below the GDP level of where we started 10 quarters out. The previous record was 5. 5 quarters out from the bottom, we had always recovered to the previous GDP level. We are now 10 quarters out. We are into the 11th quarter, and we are not out of there. If we could back up to the previous slide and look at employment again, the same kind of pattern is present in employment. These are jobs. We had, for the first few months of this year, some rather good gains in employment. The last 2 months have been declines in employment again. We are looking at something like 2014 before we will have, once again, the number of jobs that we had at the beginning of the recession in 2007. Okay. All of this started with housing. In a sense, if there's a single cause, it was the collapse of housing markets. These are housing prices as listed in the Case-Shiller 20-City Housing Price Index, month-to-month percent change. And you can see what's been happening in the last several months, really the last year. The Case-Shiller analysts described this as we're moving sideways. By housing prices, we have not yet recovered. And if we can take a look at the next slide, please. Okay, and this is the cumulative change in those housing prices. Actually, it's the percent change over the same month a year earlier. We're a little bit up over where we were a year ago, but we're still way far behind. I haven't shown it in slides up here, but if you look at housing starts or new houses sold, those numbers also are not very encouraging. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay. This slide is from data from the Federal Reserve Board, and it shows delinquency rates both for residential and commercial real estate loans. And this is not something that you like to see, that upward kind of trend there, because that foretells an increase in foreclosures down the road. Housing is simply not fixed. If I can have the next slide. Okay. The most disturbing slide I have for you today is excess reserves of the banking system. Traditionally, banks collectively in the United States would have $3 or $4 or $5 billion in excess reserves. Since late 2008, we've been at nearly $1 trillion in excess reserves. And without going into that too much, excess reserves are money that banks could lend but have not loaned out. $1 trillion in excess reserves is about 250 times what we normally have in the banking system. There are a lot of reasons for that. The credit markets still have some place to go. Last slide and I'll wrap it up. Okay, I have rounded up the, next slide please. I've rounded up the usual forecasters, and economic forecasters are typically too optimistic in a downturn. Almost everybody has lowered their growth rate forecast for GDP in the second half of this year, down from earlier figures of that were close to 3%, almost down to 2.4 or 2.3%, some people a lot lower than that. I'm a Cubs fan and an optimist. I think we will beat the forecast. Thank you.
Let's hope so. All right. Thank you, Jim Peach. We now move to Chris Erickson for a look at the state and regional economies. Chris.
Thanks, and thank you for having me here again. I do really enjoy being here. I'd like to thank the Chamber and Bank of the West, and it's enjoyable being here. If you look at my first slide, which this is, I think this is Dr. Martin's. That's Dr. Martin's slide. But if you look, when we get my first slide up, what you'll see there, if you look at it, is you'll see that the U.S. economy is having a great deal of difficulty, as Jim Peach has indicated. But there's a theme I'd like to bring forward to you folks, which is that, well, it's bad nationally, it's bad statewide, it's bad locally, but as you go from local to state to national, it gets worse. We actually are doing better in Las Cruces than the national economy. We're doing better in New Mexico than the national economy. And that's good. It's bad news that we have a weak economy. It's good news that it could be a lot worse and we're not as bad as the average for the nation. If you look at this, in fact, as Jim was mentioning, the U.S. economy has not yet caught back up to its pre-recession levels of employment, but we have in Las Cruces. At that very end to the far right on the graph, you'll see two upward spikes. That is actually positive growth in Las Cruces compared to 12 months previously. And so we're in the process of recovery at this point, even though the national economy is still in negative territory in terms of 12-month growth, and so is the state economy. Now, of course, the fact that we're actually gaining jobs in Las Cruces is good news. It would be better news if we didn't have a high unemployment rate, and our unemployment rate still remains a couple points above where it was a year ago. If I can have the next slide. This shows personal income adjusted for inflation, and what you'll notice here is that and this is over a year over year, and what you'll notice here is that the national economy, that personal income has been in negative territory year over year since the beginning of the recession, but in New Mexico, we have generally remained in positive territory, meaning that personal income has actually been growing. Now you might say, well, how could we have a decline in employment and yet have an increase in personal income? And the answer is, of course, that the personal income includes pay raises, it includes profits, it includes payments from the federal government to local families here in New Mexico, and we continue to see weak but positive growth in that area. What you see here is changes in employments over the last 12 months at different KRWG viewing areas in the area. And what you'll notice here, if you look at it, you'll notice that Las Cruces is a positive increase. We've had an increase in employment in the last 12 months of 1.2%, whereas the other regions I've indicated, except for Sierra County, which is just barely in the positive, have seen negative growth. And of course, in that, if you look at it, you see that Grant County has had the most difficulty, and that is driven by the problems in the mining industry, which there's not likely to be a recovery from any time in the near future. And so I think this illustrates pretty well how Las Cruces is doing better than the other areas that we're in the viewing area. If I could get the next slide. This shows housing price. Now, Jim showed you the Case-Shiller index. The Case-Shiller index is the gold standard for real estate prices. Unfortunately, we don't have a Case-Shiller index for New Mexico or for the local area. And so what I'm showing here is the list price per square foot of different of housing in different markets. And if you'll notice, the blue line, which is the line at the very bottom, that's for the United States as a whole. The purple line, which is the line near the top, is for the viewing area, for the KRWG viewing area outside of the Las Cruces metro area. And you'll notice that the viewing area housing prices are remaining pretty strong compared to the national number. Now, I hope no one will get too excited about this because, of course, this is the list price and we don't actually have the sales price. The sales price may differ from this. And also, we're not controlling for the size of the home or the size of the lot or things like that. This item here shows you IRA contributions to personal income for different communities. It shows you the national average. It shows you for Michigan, which is the highest recipient of any of the states. And it shows you South Dakota, which is the lowest recipient of any of the states, 50th among the states. And what this shows you is that the stimulus money is coming to New Mexico. It's about $1,400 for New Mexico, and of the 50 states, we rank 14th in terms of receipts. The final item I want to show you is the general fund. This is the state revenues for the general fund, and you'll notice that we've moved into negative territory last year, and then estimated for this year and next year we also see negative growth. This, of course, has major implications for Las Cruces because we're heavily dependent on state spending both in the public schools and also in the at NMSU. Now, there's some good news here. We had a 3.2% shortfall, but that has now been partially made up by a bill passed by Congress. This, I guess it was yesterday was passed, or Tuesday. Tuesday was passed, and that bill is providing $65 million to schools in New Mexico, which should help us quite a bit here in Las Cruces, and then also $100 million for Medicaid. And so with that, I will wrap it up. And again, I want to thank you for having me here.
All right, Chris, thank you so much. And a lot of up and down numbers there, and that's certainly also the case in the financial markets. And Professor Ken Martin has that for us. Ken.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and I'm grateful also to the Chamber and KRWG and Bank of the West and others for having us back. If we can go back one slide, we have the stock market results from the recession lows. There we go. This is a slide that I did back in April at the last economic forum, and I updated it for this presentation, and it was so stunning I just had to lead off with it. It starts on the left-hand side. You see 0%. That's the recession low. In this case, it's March of 2009, I think March 9th maybe, of 2009. And I compare it with the stock market performance in the 1982 recession. So the low there occurred in 1982, and then I tracked both of them going forward. In April, you can see the red line is the current stock market performance. And in April, it was peaking up there at roughly, what, 80% or so, 80% gain from the low in the market. And then things changed. What happened in April and May and June changed things a lot. One thing that happened was the Greek sovereign debt crisis. And I'm going to talk about these when on the next slide. But before we go to that, I traced out, someone asked me what happened in 1980, as it turns out, 84, after the point in time from today. And so I traced out 100 days after that, and the market fell off about 11% after the current point. But the interesting thing here is that we are, the stock market is tracing exactly the performance of the 1982 recession low, in spite of the fact that the recoveries, as Jim talked about, are much, much different today than they were in 1982. Let's go to the next slide and look at interest rates. This is the 10-year Treasury constant maturity rate from the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. The gray bars represent recession periods. So if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see the big gray bar is the current recession, and they have it ending, as most people think, in the summer of 2009. But what you notice is that interest rates have gone down, down, down. As the recession ended, interest rates picked back up. And in fact, on the day of our last economic forum, April 5th, the 10-year Treasury touched, it closed above 4%. And that's the last time we saw 4%. It's been down ever since. And today, it's down under 2.8%, I think in the 2.7% range. What happened? Well, there were actually 4 major events that happened. One was the Greek sovereign debt crisis that occurred. Investors thought that Greece was going to default on its debt. Since then, the European Central Bank stepped in with a rescue plan led by Germany. European banks underwent a stress test, much like the stress test in the United States. Most of the banks passed with flying colors. And this went a long way towards stabilizing those markets. But secondly, in May 6th, you may remember the flash crash in the stock market when liquidity evaporated from the high-frequency traders, and some stocks lost a tremendous amount of value. Accenture, for example, went to 0, which doesn't make any sense at all. And many exchange-traded funds dropped a lot before coming back. This had the effect of really scaring off a lot of individual investors. Third, the green shoots that we were talking about a year ago in the economy turned into brown shoots, as Jim was talking about as well. GDP growth is weak, stimulus running off, jobs aren't there. Recovery losing momentum. And then fourth, the Federal Reserve Federal Open Market Committee met yesterday, and the Fed confirmed the recovery is weak. And this altogether has driven down those interest rates. Third, the third slide looks at risk aversion. And risk aversion I measure, this is one of my favorite charts because it measures corporate bond yields in the BAA, which is the lowest investment grade corporate bond rating category, versus the 10-year Treasury yield. The higher this is, the more risk-averse investors are. And the peak there shows the recession peak, a 5 standard deviation event. What's happened since the April trouble started is that measure has turned back up. The next slide shows expected inflation rates based on the 10-year Treasury yields and the 10-year TIPS yield. TIPS are the Treasury inflation-protected securities. So you tease out from that, subtract those from each other to find the market's expectations, or a measure of the market's expectations of inflation rates. And you see since April this has been declining. It was almost back to normal in April. Since then it's been coming down. There's a big debate about whether we'll see deflation or inflation going forward. And the last slide is there any good news out there? These are Standard & Poor's 500 earnings that were surprisingly good in the last quarter. This is compared with the estimates, the analyst estimates, as of March 31st. The S&P 500 at this point in time in total was beat the estimates by 11%, led by financials at 29%. One caution here is that consumer discretionary stocks, notably retailers, are just now reporting their earnings, and so you'll want to pay attention to that over the next week or two to get a sense of how the consumer is doing.
Okay, and thank you very much. And for the remainder of our hour, we're going to have questions from our studio audience, and we do ask folks, when you come to the microphone, and please do come to the mic right now if you do have a question, please state your name and try to get out that question in a sentence or two so that we can get to as many questions as possible in our remaining time. Also, feel free to come to the mic while a question is being asked so that we will be able to move from one person to the next very quickly. We also, as we're waiting for folks to come to the mic, have questions from our viewers via email. And the first one is one that I think a lot of people have been asking. And Ken, I want to start with you. Why are the banks holding on to all of that money?
Well, that's a very good question. And a lot of people are blaming the banks, but I think it's on the other side of the equation. It's the demand side of the equation. It just seems like there's less demand than, and it's not that the borrowers are less creditworthy or aren't creditworthy, but I think businesses and individuals have a very uncertain outlook on the economy. The National Federation of Independent Business just released its Small Business Optimism Index, and it ticked down by 0.9 of a point, driven mostly by expectations of future conditions and the uncertainty that small business sees in the future.
Okay, and certainly we do have a lot of uncertainty. One good thing, we do have a question right now from our audience member, and it's Gary Carruthers. Thank you for being here.
I'm Gary Carruthers, and I'm an optimistic person. I'm optimistic about this economy. Tell me, is that a character flaw, or can you give me 3 reasons why I should be optimistic about the direction of the economy?
It may be a character flaw, but you're a Dodgers fan. Number one, forecasters have a herd instinct. And 6 or 8 weeks ago, when they started lowering their expectations for second half growth, they were doing that in response to the crisis in Europe, maybe even because of the oil spill. And I think they went down too far. And if we went back and looked at other forecasts at this point in a recovery, I think they went too far in the wrong direction. Besides, good news doesn't really get you much publicity. It's bad news. When the economy is fully recovered, I'm confident these forums will stop. Okay, the second kind of issue, Chris Erickson mentioned the passing by the House yesterday and the Senate last week of a minor stimulus bill. I think that will affect teachers, it will affect Medicaid payments in the state, and I think that's much more important than anybody gives credit for. Generally speaking, I tell my students that states don't make macro policy, but collectively, if states are laying off a lot of people, that affects the national economy. I think we're going to have much less of a decline in state and local government employment than is factored into these forecasts.
Very quickly, before we get to our next audience question, it's interesting to me, and I think a lot of people today, that we talk about $26 billion, which was what Congress approved this week, as minor. But when you compare that, of course, to the first major stimulus bill of $787 billion, $26 billion actually is minor. And I bring this up because, Chris, I know in a recent column in the Las Cruces Bulletin, you said we need another federal stimulus of about $1 trillion.
Yeah, at the time it was passed, and many analysts since then have mentioned that the original stimulus plan of $787 billion was approximately half the size it should have been. Add this, add that, and $1 trillion, if you're rounding off, would be about how much of a stimulus, additional stimulus we need. Unfortunately, there's no political appetite for that, I don't think, at this point. And so we have to be satisfied with this. And by the way, when I mention that $1 trillion, I'm including both spending and tax cuts, not just spending, not just tax cuts. And that's what we need to stimulate the economy. What we don't recognize, I think, adequately is that this is the worst recession in the post-World War II period. It arises from a very specific cause. We had perhaps a slowdown before, but what turned this into the minor disaster that it's become is the problems in the financial system, and that has resulted in a decline in investment that Ken was mentioning, the fear to lend, the fear to borrow, and to make up for that, we need to have, or one way to make up for that is to have government step into the mix and provide the final demand for goods and services.
Okay, let's get to our next question from our audience.
Hi, I'm Lloyd Covens. I'm a student. I'm curious as to the state reserve, which again, funded by money in the land holdings. It looks like going into next week when we start school here, NMSU is going to be over 19,000 students, which is terrific. And then you count all of the various DAC and all of the outstate community colleges affiliated with NMSU, it's going to be 30,000. So I guess we're setting a new record. But we all know that hard times are when people go back to the universities. My question has to do with this issue of our, I think it's 11 billion plus state reserve. And in that, since it's used to fund many of the tuition and state systems, last year Senator Sanchez submitted a proposal in the legislature to borrow against that to help shore up our state revenue shortfalls. So my question becomes, especially Chris, how is that economically viable so that we can take money that we have sitting in interest in other people's banks and use it here in the state so we can take care of our shortfall?
There's no one right answer to your question. It becomes an issue of what is more important. Is it more important to have those funds available long term to meet the needs of the citizens of New Mexico? Or, given our current crisis, is it a good idea to use those funds now to keep the economy, or to keep the state government and enhance the economy moving at a constant rate? And it comes down to I think a question of people's opinion, not so much an economic question. You're deciding, is it more important to worry about the future, more important to worry about now? There's no question that doing the kind of borrowing you're talking about would help to stabilize the state in the short run. But it could mean that we wouldn't have as much for citizens going forward. And since much of those funds are financed from oil and gas, which eventually will run out, it would mean not having those funds to stabilize the state government when oil and gas do run out, which may be not for another 25 years, but still will happen at some point.
All right, another question from our audience.
Hi, I'm John Hadley. I'm a local builder and realtor. I know you mentioned right from the start that the housing collapse kind of made it all begin to tip over. isn't it true that the lowering of the standards to qualify for a home helped that along tremendously?
Sure.
More than it would have?
And there are a lot of things that did that. From 2001 through 2006, housing prices were going up at the rate of about 13% a year. And nothing in the economy can grow at that rate for very long, including the GDP of China, if you were wondering. But we built into it a number of policy things and lack of regulatory enforcement that pushed, and low interest rates and a lot of other things pushed those housing prices up way beyond levels that could be expected to last.
And Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, initially a lot of the foreclosure activity was related to the fact that there were folks who shouldn't have gotten a mortgage in the first place, but now we're seeing a lot more foreclosure activity in cases where folks have lost their jobs, or one person in a family's lost their job, lost income.
And the most recent report from Realty Track, which follows foreclosures seriously, said that now, for the first time, it is the wealthy who are being foreclosed on. Mm-hmm. But there were all kinds of those reasons, and then it spread to the financial markets, and then it reinforces. But it's going to be a while nationally before we're back. We've still got an inventory of unsold houses, partly from foreclosure, partly from new building. We've got all kinds of things that indicate we're not out of the housing mess yet.
Okay, another question from our audience.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Louis Zana. I'm with Roof Care. We're an Albuquerque-based roofing contractor that's opening a branch office here in Las Cruces, here at the Business Incubator on campus. My question to the panel is, can you cite some specific reasons why the Las Cruces market seems to be weathering this recession better than both the state and the feds?
Yeah. One of the major reasons is because we have had the advantage of having Fort Bliss in our backyard. And Fort Bliss, of course, is mainly in El Paso, although it does spread a little bit into New Mexico. And the very rapid increase in troop levels at Fort Bliss has resulted in a pretty major stimulus to the El Paso or the Paso del Norte region, which of course includes Las Cruces. And then we also have a reasonably large retirement community, and people who are receiving pensions, who are receiving Social Security payments, their incomes tend to be more stable than the general population. Now, of course, those retirees who are living on savings and have seen their stock portfolios decline over the last couple of years aren't as happy as the people who are living on fixed pensions, but still their incomes tend to be more stable than the general population. But I think really the thing that's driving our local economy growth has been Fort Bliss. And one of the things that, by the way, indicates is because Fort Bliss has now reached its maximum troop level, that's no longer going to be a driver for growth like it has been. Now, it'll still be a very strong supporter of our local economy, but it's not going to be growing in the same way that it has been historically.
Okay.
That's been, if I could add one more thing, that's added about 1% to our local growth over the last 5 years each year.
Okay, we have another question now from our audience.
Hello, my name is Rahul, and I'm a student at New Mexico State University. My question is, both President Clinton and Bush, through their Tax Prevention Act, Increased Prevention Act, and the capital gains tax cuts, they brought down the capital gains tax from 28% to about 14%, and the proposal for the reversal of the tax cuts back to anywhere upwards of 24%. In what light do you see the proposed tax reform, and how much of an impact do you think it would have on the investment?
Ken, I think that's your area.
What I hear, what I read is that people are very concerned about the increase in taxes that will kick in at the end of the year. So I think it's one of those things that investors are, really starting to pay attention to, and I think it's going to have an impact. in next year. Now, that said, it may have an impact on revenues and increased revenues that we need.
Okay, absolutely. And we're going to continue with audience questions and also want to remind you to please come forward to the mic whenever there's an open spot there, and we will try to go from one audience member to the next. And we have another question now.
Hi, Sarah Nolan, Director of Comunidades en Acción y de Fe, a nonprofit group here in southern New Mexico. So just to go back to the question before the last, you said Fort Bliss was a driving force of our growth. What do you see in New Mexico and southern New Mexico that will be driving our productivity and growth in the future? And the second question to that is if you think it should be something different, that maybe New Mexico and southern New Mexico should be focusing on productivity and growth in another area. Thank
well,
you.
If I were looking at how to promote economic growth locally long run, so looking at the very longest term, I would argue that we need to reform our schools. Our high schools are not performing at the level they should be. We don't have graduation rates from high schools that we should have. We don't have adequate matriculation into the university level. Of course, we have a little spike up right now because of the recession. People can't find a job, so they decide to go to school, which I think is actually an excellent way to spend your time if you don't have if you don't find the kind of job you want. But that's what we really need to focus on, and partly because it's a weak place in our economy. And it's not just four-year universities, it's also important that we emphasize community colleges, which provide such an important mechanism for workforce development.
With the understanding, Chris, that a well-educated labor force brings companies in, and we've seen that all over the country.
We see that all the time.
Another quick question related to this as far as future possible job growth in this area. A lot of people were really disappointed at the failure of a federal energy bill, which would have meant a possible boost in green jobs, and certainly with wind and solar and geothermal and biofuels. We have an enormous potential for that, but without a federal renewable energy standard, a lot of folks were very disappointed. Your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, when you create green jobs through regulation, and I favor environmental regulation, I favor cap and trade. I think that's the most efficient way to deal with greenhouse gases. It's the way that it harnesses the market instead of using direct regulation. But when you regulate and you create these green jobs through regulation, you're not creating jobs on net. Regulation is going to cost us jobs as the private sector is forced to adapt to those regulations, which moves them away from maximum productivity to a socially more desirable but economically less desirable mode of production. It does mean, though, that we do benefit certain sectors of the economy, which are the green sectors, to the detriment of certain other sectors of the economy. Of course, we're a large oil and gas producing state, and those are carbon-intensive industries. And the net effect on our local economy is difficult to ascertain.
Mixed bag. Okay, we have another question from our audience.
Ford Ballard, I'm Development Director for KRWG Public Radio, and I was born in 1946, so I'm a baby boomer and facing retirement in the next few years. What advice would you have for people planning to retire in the next 5 years? And the second part, what you see the effect of this baby boomer retirement wave that's going to hit this country in a very short time. Thank you.
The demographic changes that are almost inevitable in the economy, will almost certainly lower labor force participation rates. We're going to have a growth of the labor force that comes from somewhere else, either birth rates or immigration. Japan has faced that problem for a while. For 50 years, people worried about the population bomb and a too rapidly growing population. And it's only been the last decade or so that economists have seriously addressed the question, can you make an economy grow if the population is stagnant or declining. And there's a really mixed outcome of all of that. We could do almost a whole show on this, but I think you're going to be just fine. The dependency ratio, the ratio of people working to non-working in this country, won't reach its previous peak, which occurred in 1963, until about 2050. The difference is in 1963 it was very young people who were not working. In 2050 it's going to be the old. But I think you'll be just fine.
Getting to the first part of that question, any specific advice for folks who know they're going to be retiring here in the next few years?
Oh, enjoy it.
The advice I always give is be highly diversified, and that includes diversifying internationally. Okay. I might mention too that my daughter is in the audience, and she should be expecting to work hard to support all those old people.
Okay, we're going to continue to take questions in our remaining minutes from the audience. I also, as I mentioned earlier, have questions via email from our viewers, and this one is kind of a tough one. I know earlier, Jim, you mentioned optimism. This question says, considering the job market is shrinking, unemployment's rising, jobs, especially high-paying information-based jobs, are continuing to be outsourced to other countries. There are record bankruptcies and real estate defaults. What can be done to turn this situation around? You heard earlier a proposal from Chris on $1 trillion stimulus with tax cuts and spending. Do you agree with that?
I agree with Chris, but the nice thing about this is, let me back up a second. The standard unemployment rate that we usually hear is something called U3. If we go to a broader definition of unemployment and include those people who are working part-time but want to work full-time, discouraged workers, and others, we have about a 16% unemployment rate. We have about 26 million Americans who are not employed fully. We know how to fix that. Any economist does, is to stimulate aggregate demand. The political system may not want to do that, as Chris pointed out, but we know how to fix this problem. I think what we need are massive public works projects, such as the interstate highway system that was proposed by Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s, the space program that Kennedy and Johnson proposed in the 60s. We need bold programs that will spur technological advancement and employment growth. We know how to fix this.
Jim, what do you say to people who, when they hear those proposals, are concerned about the future value of the dollar as we continue to deficit spend?
It'll strengthen the dollar if we strengthen the economy. What else can possibly happen? Mm-hmm. People worry about debt. But the cost of having 26 million people unemployed and underemployed in this country are real. We spend many billions every year on unemployment insurance, and Congress has just extended the benefits. We spend it. Even now, there was a report just a few days ago that people are claiming Social Security earlier than they would have, except for the recession, because their unemployment benefits have run out. We spend a lot of money because we have unemployed people. Let's put them to work. We can do that.
I might add one thing too, which is that a lot of people think of the United States as being the same as Greece, that we're going to default on our debt. It will never happen. And the reason for that is because we are the reserve currency of the world. International trade is done in dollars. Foreign countries hold dollars as their reserves. And now, I won't say that we won't have a bout of inflation. That's possible. That's possible. 5, 6, 7 years from now, we may be in a situation where we're paying off our debt by printing money. I'm not going to say that's impossible. But I am going to say that the idea that we'll default like Greece is virtually zero probability of that.
Let me add one thing, too. If I were to advise young people today, I would say learn Chinese or Portuguese or Russian or Korean, and study math and technical disciplines. Our research and development prowess in America is still very, very strong. The opportunities exist elsewhere in emerging markets. The opportunities for growth exist there. I'm aware of one venture capitalist who recently moved to China to further explore those kinds of opportunities. And so we have to take the blinders off and look around the world. It is a global economy.
We've already talked here about the possibility with this current environment and the potential for more stimulus to possibly in the future, as you mentioned, Chris, cause inflation. But a lot of people lately, including a lot of economists, have been talking about the risk of deflation. Is this a real risk, Jim, do you think?
I don't know, and I think it's the wrong question. But we're not going to face inflation with the excess capacity, the large unemployment, if you like, that we already have.
What about deflation?
I don't see it. I don't see the case for it. Mm-hmm. What people are worried about is the economy falling off the cliff, that we'll go into a double dip and that prices will begin to fall. I can't make a strong case for that.
Okay. A follow-up to that, we were really general earlier when we were talking about stimulus in terms of tax cuts and possible spending. You specifically mentioned, Jim, public works projects. Are there any other areas, if another stimulus was to occur, from an economist's perspective, you believe would be the absolute right thing to do?
Oh, I'm biased, but I prefer direct spending to tax cuts. The tax cuts, there's some evidence that what consumers did, for example, was to reduce their debt loads. We need that money spent, and if there's a tax cut, we have an option of spending it or paying off old debt or
and
just sitting on it.
The savings rate's going up.
Savings rate's going up. So I prefer direct spending. If you want my list of options there, I can give it to you. I think we need to do an awful lot on infrastructure and transportation. I think our nation's schools should be built so that they are at least as nice as our casinos. I genuinely believe that. But ultimately, if we have to, the government can be an employer of last resort. And there's plenty of work to be done. Let's do that instead of spending it on things that unemployment benefits. Let's put them to work directly. Not increases in food stamps, not increases in other kinds of entitlement programs, but direct employment programs. We know how to do that.
Okay, we do have about 10 minutes left, so we certainly encourage our audience to continue to participate with us. We've had a lot of really great questions during this Chamber Economic Forum, and we'll continue to get more of those. We have someone right now coming up to the mic. Thank you so much.
Okay, my name is Dan Townsend, and I've lived a little longer than some people here, and I remember that and this hasn't been too long ago, but some people remember Leona Helmsley. And she was famously quoted as saying that only the little people pay taxes. And of course, she spent a little time in the Federal Slammer for going a bit overboard on that. But the issue really we keep looking at this top 5% being given tax relief to stimulate the economy. And in fact, what's happening is that the top 5% has been aggregating more and more control over the economy at a very high rate. And the reason people weren't paying attention is because of all this toxic debt they were accumulating through easy access to credit cards and other things. Now, of course, that went away. And we still have this aggregation of debt, which puts us with certain third world countries in that respect.
So, sir, your question is asking the panelists, or one panelist in particular, to comment on tax policy as a way to stimulate the economy?
In respect to the upper 5%. In other words, do we not have a need for a more even tax policy, not just the lower class paying the taxes, and tax relief for the upper 5%? Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to take that one on?
Well, I am. One of the issues that I think gets some play, but probably could deserve more play, is the role of income distribution in society. And we've, I think, in the last few years, and people often think it's funny that I do this because I consider myself to be a libertarian, a market-oriented economist. But I think what's happened is that the wealthy in society, particularly, the wealthy in society to a large extent in the eastern elites and in Washington, D.C., have managed to, in a certain sense, corrupt the system so that the benefits are flowing more to them than would be justified in a completely free market. And one of the ways to balance that so that we get a outcome that's more consistent with a free market is to use taxes and to tax the rich. Now, that's a kind of I think, a philosophical answer to your question, and so let me give you a more blunt answer, which is I think a higher tax rate on the wealthy is justified in the current circumstances.
Okay, another question from our audience.
Hi, Adrian Velarde with KRWG, and I wanted to jump back a little bit to the question regarding people's debt levels. And one of the things when we were receiving the tax credits in the past, one of the reasons was we were told people weren't saving enough. Now we're told people aren't spending enough. Is there a happy medium, and where do any of you see that kind of falling?
I don't know where the happy medium is, but consumers have had lots of debt, and that's the basic problem is this is a deleveraging economy. Consumers are deleveraging. In past years, past recessions, it's been led by consumers increasing their credit. This time it's the other way around.
Of course, Wall Street wants folks to spend,
very
right?
hard. Well, so does the federal government. Yeah.
Okay. Another question from the audience.
Yes, good afternoon. My name's Tress Libby. I'm an NMSU alum from '02 and a banker. I guess my positive takeaway that we should all keep in mind is the economy is going to be fine because of the resiliency of the American people. I would pose that we need less stimulus, and given that this is really a debt hangover we're experiencing, given our economy is driven by consumer confidence, wouldn't it make sense to have simple solutions that don't include 1,000-page bills that the consumer can be, understanding of, and have the confidence to spend and hire more people and small business confidence grow and capitalism work?
And I don't disagree with what you're saying. The question is, the problem we have right now is that we're in a deleveraging, as is being said. We've seen this in other countries around the world. There's been about 20 incidents of this kind of a recession around the world in different countries: Thailand, Malaysia, Japan, Russia. And when you have that kind of deleveraging, it can be very difficult for the economy to recover on its own. And if you look at countries around the world that have dealt with this thing, one of the things that they need to do, and this is where the bailout comes into play, is to get that debt overhang out of the way. And that kind of getting that debt overhang out of the way often requires government action. And we did it ourselves. In fact, the poster child for the very most efficient handling of this is the S&L crisis in the 1980s. And so that leaves open the possibility for the government coming into the marketplace and trying to overcome this deleveraging issue that we're facing right now.
Ken? With respect to your comment about business and optimism and the NFIB's Small Business Optimism Index, they asked small business what their number one kind of problem was, and is regulation. It's increasing regulation, and that creates a lot of uncertainty, especially with healthcare reform, with FINREG that's been recently passed, and the regulators are going to be rolling out rules after rule after rule. And in small business, doesn't, my sense is they don't quite know how to respond other than let's try to maintain the status quo. So it's going to be a while, I think, before this kind of settles out.
One more minute left, and Jim, I'll give you the final word. Our next economic forum will be about the time of the midterm elections, and that was a question from viewer email. What effect do you think midterms will have?
Oh, first, I think unless employment starts to pick up, the economy is going to have a great effect on the midterm elections. I actually think the rhetoric that is going on now on both sides is probably harmful to the process. And I would hope that after the election that we can address real serious problems that the nation faces. We have not attacked the energy problem. We have not done enough in any number of areas, especially education, and for long-term growth, that's a key. And so I hope that after the election we'll get after it.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for participating today. Thank you to the Chamber of Commerce of Greater Las Cruces, and most of all, thank you to you at home. Without your support, this type of programming would not be possible. You can become a member anytime at krwg.org. Thank you.